5 o'clock sharp, time to start our webinar. So good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are, and welcome to the third webinar in our series, Business and Human Rights. Today, on the topic of gender dimensions of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights and what it means to protect, respect, and remedy women's rights in a business context. Why this webinar? I don't think I need to tell you that it's a reality that women and girls experience adverse impacts of business activities differently and often very disproportionately, or that they also face additional barriers in seeking access to effective remedies. Who has not read about women being underrepresented in management positions or in boards, just to give an example? So it's critical that business enterprises are gender responsive and follow relevant best practices that you are going to learn about today. For those of you who have missed the two previous webinars or would like to revisit them, the recordings are available on the Institute's YouTube channel, as today's webinar will be in a few days' time. For those that are joining us for the first time, I am Luísa Ferreira, Head of Social at the European Investment Bank Institute, the philanthropic arm of the EIB, the EU long-term financial institution, and I will be your host for today's webinar. And it's my great pleasure to introduce you to today's speakers, Francisco Granja de Almeida and Sandra Di Moise. Francisco was one of the speakers for the two previous webinars on the series, and for some of you already a household name. Francisco is an associate lawyer at international law firm Vieira de Almeida and Associados, VdA, based in Lisbon, Portugal. He works in VdA social economy and human rights practice, where they cooperate with NGOs and advise businesses on their human rights responsibilities. Francisco will be joined later by Sandra Di Moise, who will share her testimonial on how corporate action can have a positive impact on gender equality. It will be very hard to summarize Sandra's accomplished career in a few minutes, and I will not attempt to do so, but I would like to share with you some highlights. Sandra is currently the managing partner at AIC Capital, a private equity firm, and she's a former CEO of several financial institutions that include Barclays and Citi. Sandra has also been involved as a board member in numerous non-profit organizations focused on digital transformation, financial inclusion, financial education, and ESG. Currently, Sandra serves as a board member at Connect Families, a non-profit organization based in Miami. Sandra also leads several diversity and inclusion committees. She's a speaker at diversity global forums, the ambassador for the Female Lead organization, and a mentor for the Professional Women Network. And I will stop here. But as you can see, both Francisco and Sandra are the right people to answer the questions you may have on the topic. So if throughout the presentation you have some questions, write them in the chat box and use the option to send to all panelists, and they will try to answer all of them at the end of this webinar. So thank you, and now I invite Francisco and Sandra to join us. Sandra and Francisco, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Luísa. It's a great pleasure to be back here. And I would like to start by thanking the European Investment Bank Institute for this opportunity, for giving us a platform to share these legal developments and also to stress the importance of this topic within the sustainability spectrum. As Luísa said, today we're going to be talking about the gender dimensions of the United Nations Guiding Principles, which means that we're going to focus on the women's and the girls and the gender perspective of the impact of business and corporate activities within human rights. So within our series of business and human rights, we've been taking many topics, and today we're going to look at the gender dimension of such. But first, let's tackle the big myth. We like to start our presentations with the myths. This is the idea that a truth has been gaining a weight within our discourse of human rights that we would like to tackle. Because it's not a truth, it's a lie, it's a big myth, and it's important to start by this detail. I remind you to, if you just jumped into our webinar and you haven't checked the previous webinars on business and human rights, this is a very, 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 very short version of those. So it's going to be quite concentrated. So the big myth that we would like to tackle is that only the state and the international organizations should be concerned with human rights. Well, this is a myth, and we would like to start by saying that the idea that businesses have human rights responsibility might seem a little bit exotic. And this is because human rights were established by states for states. Human rights are a substract of international law, and because of that, states, their individuals, and international organizations have been the main subjects of the human rights discourse. But throughout the years, the myth that only the state and international organizations should be concerned with human rights has become more clear that is what it is, a myth, and that the truth is that businesses have a duty to respect human rights. And how so? Before advancing, how so? Because businesses and human rights are connected. We've seen throughout the years that multiple companies have global supply chains. So a business might be headquartered in the US, have its factory in Portugal, and be importing its materials from Bangladesh. In this case, what happens is that there is a global value chain and global impact of such company. Thus, a company is a stakeholder for the human rights of the people involved in its operations. And today, as we've seen, we would like to focus our discussion on business and human rights within the gender dimension of such. So we're going to look at the disproportionate impact that business activities have on the human rights of women and girls. Like Louisa said in the beginning, obviously all human rights are universal. If you want to take a look at the entire concept of human rights, check our first webinar, because there we go in depth on this concept. But human rights are universal, but special groups of people have special human rights, and women and girls are treated specially because sometimes businesses affect them disproportionately, and disproportional effects require disproportional measures, and this is what we're going to look at. This was clearly the case in the case of Lote Ocho, which is a case that I would like to share with you in order to give an example of how this works in practice. So imagine a Canadian company that has an extracting site in Guatemala, and that in Guatemala, that Canadian company creates a subsidiary, so another company held by the Canadian mother company, and that subsidiary contracts private security agencies. So the company in Guatemala, which is held by the company in Canada, hires a special security, private security company to protect the mining site and its surroundings. What happened in the case, so a typical case of global supply chains and universal business. What happened in the case of Lote Ocho is that the private security company hired by the subsidiary committed human rights violations in the women living within the nearby communities. And those human rights violations were severe. They were related to sexual assault and physical abuse. And what happened is that these women came together and all actually sued the company, so the mining company in Canada, for its relation with the private security agency that was hired by its subsidiary. So you can see how this is a matter of extraterritorial obligation. And it's very interesting because in this direct case, the women, as we've pointed out, were disproportionately impacted because of their status of fragility, because we don't have time to go within all the details, but in sum, what happened is that these women protested against the company's undertaking of the lands nearby the extracting site, and they stayed at home with the children in a protest. And then the human rights violations occurred on the hands of this private security agency. And as we've seen, the responsibility falls. So this is a matter just to demonstrate how human rights violations are connected to business action. Very swiftly, I would just like to give another example how businesses may impact the human rights of girls and women in the disproportionately matter. And this is why, if you have one idea, one takeout of this webinar, is that when you're conducting human rights due diligence, and that's webinar number 2, so take a look at that as well, you need to have a special lens in the way that you're doing it to take a look at how women are being affected. It's a special lens that you add on to the entire process. It's not just a tick in a box, it's an effective look at the rights of the women and girls. A very common issue is the collection of drinkable water, because in many parts of the world, especially the global south, what happens is that within societies, women and girls have the social role of having to go and collect drinkable water from a drinkable water source. What happens is, in a connection with social and environmental issues, which is very important never to put these two apart, a company might pollute the course of water through its activities. Because the water gets polluted by corporate activity, what happens is that women will have to walk further along, so more miles, to collect drinkable water. And this will make them more susceptible to attacks, more vulnerable to the pollution itself, because they might be in contact with the polluted water to begin with, and that girls that typically walk with their mothers are going to stay more time away from school. So this is just an example how a cycle of injustice might prejudice the human rights of women and girls. Moving forward, what is the UN's answer to this? Well, we've already talked about the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which is the most authoritative framework on this matter of the connection between companies and human rights. And what this framework does is to publish 31 principles that will guide businesses to mitigate the risks of having human rights violations within the global chains or their own activities, and also to guide business to respect human rights. In this session, we're going to talk more about the gender dimensions, which is the second document that you see on the right, where the working group on business and human rights of the United Nations read the guiding principles and applied a gender dimension to each of its 31 principles. So if you want to take a look at how to align your business activities with the human rights of girls and women, in special, take a look at the gender dimensions, because this is an authoritative interpretation guide that shines a light on the UNGPs and adds this dimension of the gender. Because in every of the 31 principles, there will be a commentary, especially regarding the women and girls and how to do this for this special group. Human rights due diligence. Well, this slide gave us an entire webinar. So I'll try to be as swift as possible so we can hear the exciting testimony of Sandra as well. But basically, human rights due diligence is the ongoing management process that a company undertakes in order to comply with this responsibility of respecting human rights. And it has 4 dimensions. And I would like to stress that in every legislative initiative, if any law, any regulation, these 4 main dimensions of the due diligence are present. Typically, these are always present, these 4 steps, which are identifying actual or potential adverse human rights impacts, integrating findings across relevant company processes, and then track the effectiveness of these measures and always communicate how impacts are being addressed. I would like to give a quick example of each one of the steps. Regarding the identification of actual or potential human rights impacts, we have modern slavery, child labor, human trafficking, sexual harassment. These are all typical human rights violations that occur in the hands of companies. And what I would like to do with a big note is that companies are not the devil. Or okay, so nothing of this is trying to argue that companies are may prejudice human rights per se. On the contrary, we've seen the UN clarifying this over and over. Companies bring development and companies bring the conditions to effective human rights in many areas. This is how not to do harm. It's a principle of do no harm. And how you do this? Through identifying where your company might be having an impact. After this, you need to take action, right? So update your procurement criteria, make contracts reflecting your own due diligence, and after this, track to see if it's working. How can you do this? Establish a multidisciplinary force within the company, also take in-local visits, and after this, never forget, publish a report to put the movement going and to inform your stakeholders how you're conducting your human rights obligations. And what we've seen through the document of the working group is that in the entire process that you see in front of you, you should apply a gender lens. So I would like to stress that the gender perspective, it's not an add-on. It's not a tick in the box that you do within your checklists of human rights due diligence. It's actually an embedded and effective lens that you apply in the entire process. So in the entire process, you want to identify if the women and girls impacted by your business activities might be in specific or a special risk. So you apply human rights due diligence through a gender lens. So the entire process should have this lens. Again, I know that I'm going fast, but this was an entire webinar beforehand. And how do we start? Because we know from experience that businesses look at human rights due diligence as, okay, where do I start? How do I identify where to begin? Because this is very overwhelming. And we all know that in the EU, we're preparing mandatory human rights due diligence legislation. So the first step, and this is a key step, is to identify the salient human rights issues. In this webinar, we're taking a look at the specific issues surrounding girls, right? So you have to look within your business context, your industry, your geographies, and your operations. So it is not a standard process for every company. You need to look at your operations context and then use 3 criteria: the scale, the scope, and the remediability. When we're talking about scale, we're looking at the gravity of the human rights violations. So, for example, for a business to take away the possibility of girls going to school, it's not that it's less severe. It's not that the human rights to education is less important than the human rights to physical integrity, but the fact is that it's more severe within that moment if you compare not going to school with being sexually harassed. So this is a very hard criteria to explain, but it's connected to the idea that some human rights in a given moment might be more urgent than others. So this 3 criteria helps you understand how, and scale is this dimension. Regarding the scope, we're looking at the number of people that are being impacted through the human rights due diligence. So a scope, it tells us Did one girl was affected with no right to education, or 1,000 girls were affected with no right to education? It helps you guide your criteria through the number of people. And then the irremediability. This is are the human rights that were violated irremediable or not? Because if they are irremediable, like the human right to physical integrity or health many times, or even life, then that's the most salient issue. So once again, these three criteria are supposed to be used together within the business context in order to help businesses identify where to start. It's not that it doesn't that the other human rights don't care. It's just that it's a starting point where you should start first. Because as we know, there are many human rights and there are many business operations, and one must start somewhere. So key step is to identify the salient women's human rights issues. And for this, I would like to just give a little highlight of the working group's report on this matter. So as we've seen, the United Nations Guiding Principles were published, and then the working group published a report in the UN regarding the special impacts of women. And these are such the main conclusions that you shouldn't forget. The first is that it recalls that women's human rights are secured by international human rights law. We cannot forget that there's a special treaty, which is the CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, that tells us the special rights, human rights of women without the context of business, so typical state dimension. So it recalls that these women's rights are embedded in this treaty. After this, we can also tell you that this implies the report of the UN is very inclusive in the way it defines womanhood. It gets to define womanhood. I'm going to read you the first paragraph. As all references to women in the present report should be understood to include girls as well as transgendered and intersex women. So you see that the United Nations Working Group is taking an inclusive look at the issue and is making that effort to be as diverse as possible. After this, also to consider the intersectional nature of these norms. And what is intersectionality in the nutshell? Basically, what it says is that the dimensions on which someone might be discriminated, they don't leave apart, they intersect. So basically, if a person of color is also a woman, there's two motives intersecting one, causing greater risk of discrimination. This is very clear in the report in paragraph 21 that I'm going to read very briefly to give you a objective perspective that says, a gendered approach to decision-making by states and businesses should also consider the intersectional nature of discrimination. For example, a single mother, a migrant, a woman, a lesbian, a woman of color, and a woman with disability may experience discrimination and sexual harassment at work in various ways. So this is a very important theory that was advanced by Kimberly Crenshaw, in just a curiosity, in the early 90s. So it's a very old theory by an American lawyer, Kimberly Crenshaw, explains this factor of intersectional dimensions of discrimination, and it is common to the entire language of the report and the CEDAW. So take a look at that as well when you're reading through this. Also, the CEDAW, the working group identifies gender windows, the so-called gender windows. Basically, is telling us that within the United Nations Guiding Principles, there are windows already talking about the rights of girls. If you take a look at the Principle 18, for example, of the UNGPs, there is a specific norm saying that businesses should look at the higher risk of girls and women to be impacted by their operations. So the report highlights that the UNGPs that were approved exactly 10 years ago in 2011 already have this gender windows where the topic is directly put to scene. And also what this report does very well is that it stresses the urgency for action. And it does this in a very clear manner. The report shows us that 71% of the estimated number of people in modern slavery are women. This is a huge number that highlights how severe and how urgent it is for businesses to take a special action, because as you can see, they are especially affected. 71% of the people in modern slavery are women, and this report is trying, and the gender dimensions of the UNGPs are trying to help businesses understand how they can do better and how to respect human rights abuses. Not the abuses, how to respect human rights, excuse me. And how are we going to do this? Beyond taking a gender lens on the entire process of the human rights due diligence, there is a three-step cycle that is important for businesses and also for the state. So it's the cycle between having gender responsive assessments, gender transformative measures, and gender transformative remedies, all of them working together. For example, in the assessment of your activities, consider intersectionality and collect sex disaggregated data to take a look at the issue in a concrete manner, and then approve public commitments related to this. These are the measures, right? Collaborate with NGOs that know the in-local situation. Hire experts that will help you move the process in the way of respecting human rights. And then the gender transformative remedies. It's very important to focus on reparations. And to do so, you need to address both specific and systematic abuses affecting women. Just a very quick note, because I'm running out of time. I would just like to notice that the EU Mandatory Human Rights and Environmental Due Diligence Directive, that if you want to take a look, we tackled in a previous webinar in more in depth, has a specific paragraph for this topic. So it's not that this topic was forgotten in the shelf of the UN, it is within the approved version of the EU directive. And it says that the adverse impacts on human rights, the environment, and good governance are not gender neutral. Undertakings are encouraged to integrate the gender perspective in their due diligence processes. They can find guidance on the UN booklet, Gender Dimensions. So this is just to show you that if the EU directive comes into force, we have this recommendation right there. So this guide is already a great start to align your business operations with the human rights approach. Just a very quick note before handing on the stage to Sandra and to develop the bridge towards gender equality, because one thing is to mitigate human rights abuses. Another thing is to promote and have action within this. The Sustainable Development Goal 5 tackles this issue, and it gave us a common language within the entire stakeholders of sustainability to talk about gender equality. And it gives us 9 targets very related to human rights that shows us how gender equality is a path towards sustainability. Wrapping the presentation, I would like to give the word to my very, very exciting co-lead for today. Sandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. That was great. I personally learned a lot, Francisco, so thank you very much. It was very, very interesting exposure. Let me go here to share a few slides, then I will start. So here we go. So again, tremendous pleasure to be here. Appreciate the invitation by European Investment Banking Institute and by yourself as well, Francisco. So I was invited to provide a testimony. My idea is to bring to life some of the topics that was covered very well by Francisco today. So I would like to split in 3 areas, right? So my international corporate background as a female leader and as well a female executive. What I see as correlation between human rights and diversity in corporations. And then finally, I can talk a little bit about entrepreneurship for women, because now I'm an entrepreneur, so I can give you some stories about that as well. So first, let me introduce myself. Sandra Di Moise, I'm a woman, Latin, engineering agronomist, career in international financial services. So as you can see, it's a very male-dominant areas. I was born in Brazil, Italian by family and American by choice. I lived and work in Latin America, in Europe, and USA. I have 3 passports, a Brazilian, an European, and American. So I consider myself a citizen of the world. I studied agronomist in Brazil. At that time, I won some prizes, and I was fortunate to be invited to be trained in USA and Canada. And just so you to know, the sector that I chose was, represented only by 5% of women, right? So I recall my first gender discriminatory barrier in Canada. At that time, only men could go to those genetic farms, and I had to convince the CEO otherwise, and I was able to do that. Back in Brazil, I had my first job. I started working for Citi Group, a consumer business. I specialized in marketing, and I did several executive programs in US with Wharton, Kellogg, Columbia, and other universities as well. I was the first woman in 25 years of company in Brazil to reach the vice president position and be part of the executive committee as well, which was very new thing there. I was very young. And at that time, I was not aware of the model was becoming to other women. I felt just extremely proud to be reaching senior positions based on my merits and starting breaking several barriers. Following that, my career options were to develop internationally with Citi. I accepted a position in New York City, and then I moved to Miami. I was there leading the investment business, a financial business, a sector that is led normally by white men. So then came one of the most interesting moments of my career, one that I feel proud is still today, the opportunity to become a CEO in Central America for Citi. Funny enough, I did not apply for that position. I did not think I was ready for that jump, but I was encouraged by another very senior lady at Citi. And well, long story short, I was the selected candidate, becoming the first woman in 100 years of Citi in that region, and to become their CEO. By the way, I loved the job. So here I like to bring a few myths, right? Women don't help each other. I totally disagree with that. I think it's not true. But that is another myth, which I think is true. Syndrome of imposter, right? Quite true. Women never feel they are ready or prepared enough for a role. But men, on the other hand, if they just 70% prepared for the role, they feel they are fully and super prepared. So that's a big difference right there. So there's a message here to the group. Be self-confident that you can learn anything you want. Be open for opportunities and welcome the changes. Have the right attitude and the commitment and the passion to make it successful. Invest in networking. Be brave, be curious, be authentic, be kind, but most than anything, be happy, right? So as first-time CEO, I start to understand the value of the legacy. The most important thing was not only the results, but what you leave behind to the others, the difference you make in people's lives. And there started my journey as a D&I leader for the organizations. And I have to tell you, sometimes it felt very lonely being the only woman at the table, the only woman at the meetings. So following the position in Central America, I was invited back to USA, leading again Latin America, this time payments and credit card business. Then came the move to a British bank, a British company, Barclays, and my amazing professional experience and my amazing journey in Europe started. First, I was based in Madrid and then in Lisbon. As a CEO for Europe, I intensify my acting and my influence on D&I as a leader, as an individual as well, mentoring female executives, creating and promoting diversity programs in my own business and in others. So then I asked the question, why diversity and inclusion is so important in corporations? As I mentioned, I had an international career in 2 large international financial institutions, Citi and Barclays, where I learned that diversity is a fact, but inclusion is our decision. As you can imagine, I felt privileged. My executive committee had 90 different nationalities. Dealing with so many cultural backgrounds, you definitely learn how to respect traditions. The power of diversity for the company is priceless. If nothing else, because you have within the company a reflection of your target customer segment, a work environment that enables creativity, innovation, and mutual respect, tremendous tool to attract and retain talents. As a leader, regardless in USA or in Europe, you should always promote diversity and inclusion. It's a prerequisite of a high-performing team, and the fact that there will be several points of view and perspectives makes every discussion richer, impacting positively the team performance, the team satisfaction, and therefore the company financial results, the company bottom line. To continue my professional trajectory, Barclays' decision was to divest from Europe. So I had the responsibility at that point to lead the sales of such business while leading the business itself. Leading in challenging times is very hard, but it's extremely rewarding when the outcome is excellent, when you as a leader put your team first. There, I moved back to USA within Barclays, near Philadelphia. Stayed there for a couple of years, and in that moment, I made one of the most transformational decisions of my professional life, to become an entrepreneur. I accepted an invite from an ex-colleague of mine from Citi to be his business partner in a private equity based in Miami with clients from different parts of the globe. So in early 2019, I started my career as an entrepreneur. And regarding diverse leadership, both in Europe and USA, I joined and created diverse networks, mentoring female programs as well. In parallel, my life as an executive and entrepreneur, I'm board member for nonprofit organizations supporting Latin Americans in Florida, board member FinTech Startup in SA, advisor of Endeavor Miami and Maze Impact, both organizations to scale up startups. So I mentor, I advise the founders, but I'm also ambassador of a UK organization, the Female Lead, dedicated to offer alternative role models. You cannot be what you cannot see. Girls at age 10 to 15 years old, if exposed to strong female role models, have an exceptional higher probability to be more successful in life. It's a program with education, schools engagement. So as you can see, I am passionate about this cause. So why we still see a gap in gender leadership despite all the efforts? There are so many reasons, but I can list some of them. The role of the women in society has changed significantly only over the past half century and is still evolving, but not universally yet. Belinda Gates has a book. It's called The Moment of Lift, How Empowering Women Change the World, which I highly recommend. When she started her foundation, she began spending time with women in the world's purest places. She shared stories about women inequality around the world, and the data is unequivocal. No matter in the world you were born, your life will be harder if you were born a girl. In very poor countries like Africa, less than 2 years of education for girls compared to boys. 1 in 5 girls are married before turning 18. So in high-income countries, gender inequality tends to be most visible in the workplace. The reason the pace of the progress has been so glacial is no mystery. The world has refused to make gender equality a priority. It's not the global leaders' agenda. It's not the political agenda. There is no financial commitment for that. So there is a common knowledge that women do not have the same rights in all countries. No right to express themselves, to study, to take a job, to vote, to own a property. Not every country respects gender diversity, comes to my mind the saddest example, a very recent one, when Taliban shut the school doors for girls, stopping female education and robbing them a chance for a better future. Other reasons I can think about is the women feel they have additional obligations than the men. The house, the family, the kids, and most of the times they really do. So also women are not as self-confident as men, even when they have better qualifications, and we spoke about that. But also I want to highlight here that references in corporations are needed, really needed. If the corporation has a female CEO or female senior level, more probability other women will want to work there. They will know it's possible and that the company has an inclusive, rewarding system and promotes diversity. Again, you cannot be what you cannot see. You need to have a strong reference to be able to have ambition to reach it. References help the changing process as well. When you live and work in a diverse and inclusive environment, it's your norm. You will replicate it anywhere you go. You will be the advocate of diversity and inclusion. Here, I'd like to give some advice to the audience. Those issues will not go away by itself. Wherever you go, be that advocate. Make sure you build and encourage others to build a diverse team that complement itself. Don't look only for clones. Challenge yourself to bring difference. Embrace the difference and mentor a girl. So how to build diversity in corporations? How can we promote more gender diversity? What can we do as leaders? What are the actionable items so that we achieve, diverse and inclusion? In large corporations, large international corporations like Citi and Barclays and so many others, that is really a focus on building diversity. They focus a lot on gender, race, age, disability, etc. They have targets. There's tracking progress. There are discussions in talent reviews, opportunities for all, etc., and etc. But we know that that's not the case everywhere. And we also know that even in those companies, it's still a challenge. We still see gender gap in senior positions in some markets. So key actions here. Start with the recruitment. You must ensure you have a diverse group of candidates. Your recruitment external firm should be briefed to do the same. Have a diverse selection team to interview and select the candidates. And very, very important, create an environment which welcomes and promotes diversity. Leaders should be the example. Men and women, we need to be a reference. Be mentors to female, create networks, create forums. So when VdA and the bank invited me initially to this event, I was very honored, very, very honored. But I had some doubts. What do I know about human rights? I'm not even a lawyer like Francisco. I have worked all my life in financial services. Only afterwards, really with some reflection, I realized and made the connection between D&I and human rights. After all, articles and the principles beyond the Declaration of the Human Rights state that all human beings are free and equal in dignity and rights without distinction of race, color, gender, language, religion, etc. The same exactly principles sustain the diversity and inclusion policies that exist in the corporate world, namely in the financial institution, multinational companies, such as the one I've worked in my past and I have mentioned earlier. But it's good to make a distinction between diversity and inclusion. That is because, there's really not the same, and I like to bring this up. So diversity is about representation, meaning you have diversity in a company when you have representation of that society where you are established. men, women, Caucasian, Latin, Asian, African American, heterosexual, gay, etc., etc. So diversity is just a factor or a matter of makeup of composition. Now, inclusion, on the other hand, is about participation. It's a choice of a matter of belief and behavior. Diverse benefits not only, no one, unless we can unleash its power. Inclusion is what unleashes the power of diversity with a group and an organization. That drives creativity and prosperity. The goal should be to create truly inclusive environments. It's proven that those will generate innovation and performance. In both financial institutions that I have worked, D&I agenda was a reality across the globe, and high importance was given to it. It covered 5 pillars, gender, race, age, sexual orientation, and disability. Policies were in place to prevent discrimination towards some of those groups during recruitment, as I mentioned, career progression, and others. But more important was the awareness to this type of topics about the reference and about the role models. There is a common saying that you do not wish what you do not know. So thus the importance of every single practical measure, activity, or event towards raising awareness. Sharing examples of success is critical. And more the impact on the organization itself, you must understand that people and organizations are organisms of a larger society. Thus, the impact on the society itself. Actually, many of the events on the D&I had a much broader role and scope post-boundary of the companies. The impact of diversity and inclusion in organization is powerful. Recent studies support and identify 5 advantages or benefits of a diverse workforce and inclusive environment. Greater creativity and innovation. It will help to generate different ideas and see the problem in different perspectives. People that are alike usually think alike. Increased productivity. Research has found that diversity increases productivity by 35%, as per a report from McKinsey. Diverse financially really matters. Reduce employee turnover. It makes people feel valued and accepted. Of course, they will be most likely to stay in the company. Connect to a broader range of customers. A broader base of employees is more likely to represent a broader range of customers and customer needs for a typical brand, product, or service. And, finally, increase revenues. A recent study from Boston Consulting Group from 2018 found that diverse companies generated near 20% increase in revenues. So you may ask, we talk about creating D&I environments. I have a very old friend of mine that some of you may even know because it's Mirta Casanova, who is the head of European Institution of Managing Diversity. She once told me, when you are recruiting, Sandra, demand it. Make sure the curriculum on your table follows the principle. The rest will happen. I really feel that this is great, but I don't think that's alone is sufficient, but it's definitely a very good way to start. So now talking a little bit about entrepreneurship, because I promised that I will close with that topic. So entrepreneurship is to take risks, is to make the impossible feasible, never giving up. It's the art of creating opportunities, creating jobs, and transforming lives. But you may ask me, right? What is to be a female entrepreneur? Is there any discrimination being a female entrepreneur? Well, I would say yes. It's a huge yes, that is. So I'd like to share some of my most recent experience as an entrepreneur. I was looking manufacturer for some data regarding female founders, entrepreneurs, and found some from the Crunchbase from 2020. So it's recent, so it made us feel and may think a little bit about it. Unfortunately, this covers only gender, but you know that D&I is much more beyond that. Look at that, only 20% of the newly founded startup have a female founder. And this number has doubled since 2009. This was only 9.5% before. In 2019, 27 billion were invested into companies with at least a female founder. Okay, this represented about 13% of all seed, venture, and corporate venture dollars. But a company only led by female founders had a residual figure of 3%. So let me make it very, very clear. 87% for male founders only. 10% a combination between female and male founders. And a female founder only 3% of venture capital. So women leaders eager to run startups will struggle with challenges unique to their gender, namely first impression bias. Women are 2 times more likely to be treated negatively when pitching for money. Less than robust support system. While there is an increasing number of organizations to help out this point, women have less of a network of advice, mentorship to seek out. Capital raising roadblocks. A report from SCORE states that female founders ask funding less than males, when they ask, they usually receive less. So we all know the first thing to address the problem is to recognize that there is a problem. The data is out there and is quite explanatory. So personally, I was fortunate. I joined an existing startup, a private equity, to be a partner. It was transformational to me. I adapted and I just love it. I feel very proud of my brave decision to live in the corporate world, to leave the comfort zone and explore unknown territories for me. But given my 30 years in the international financial services, my strong reputation, my network really opened the doors. But for newly female founders, challenges are huge. So what do we have to do here? We must support. In my case, I'm an advisor and a mentor of 2 startups organizations, scale-up programs in USA and in Europe. Lots of my time, really lots of my time are dedicated to female founders. I'm also planning to be an advisor for a foundation focused on pre-seed startups only led by women. Normally, you see organizations supporting startups, but with track record and not in early stage. But who supports women entrepreneurs starting from scratch a new business? Not many, but it's so key, so important as well. Also, I support them as a board member, advising on the strategy, how to be sustainable, how to have successful business. So lastly, being ambassador to Female Lead, supporting young girls at school to be more complete and better women through positive reference, role model, and education. So to finalize, D&I has a similar pace in organization than human rights have to society. It reinforces the fundamental rights of non-discrimination, as all human beings are born equal in rights, without the discrimination, without the distinction of race, gender, and religion. And it's our decision, our choices, our actions that drive the society to a more equal, balanced, and sustainable, inclusive environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I wish I could clap, but I can't, Sandra. I wish you could see me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Luisa is still muted, I guess.
I was clapping, so I cannot do 2 things at the same time, apparently. So I'm going to start with a question, which is for both of you. Imagine that you would have the power to immediately implement a measure at the world level that would contribute to increase equality of opportunities. What would be the measure?
What a
I
great
don't know
question.
who wants to answer, if it's Francisco, if it's Sandra.
Francisco, start. I just have to get a sip of water.
You go ahead, Sandra. I can take the question from a human rights due diligence perspective, and then if you want me to add from a D&I perspective, I can try as well. From a human rights due diligence perspective, I think the one thing that I would, if one thing could be done, I would say listen to the NGOs in local. So if a business that is operating in geographies where the state doesn't have, the social state is not that present, or the institutions are not working that profoundly and effectively, what I would, if I could do one thing, I would, it's tough. One thing I would ask for human rights NGOs reports and dialogue, because you need to do a grassroots policy, because or otherwise you need to combine two, but start there. Listen to the victims always.
Sandra?
Yeah, I think, if I see the perspective of governments, I would say that have inclusive and transparent policies. I think transparency is key. I would say that, everything starts with providing access to education, access to health, and access to finance. If you have, fair access and transparent access and policies to all those three elements, I think it's a big game changer, right? And in corporations, I think I cover some of the things. I would say cannot be only few corporations providing this transparency and these policies, has to be across the board, from a startup to a large corporation. You need to think about a very inclusive policies, diverse bench of candidates, diverse selection of interviews, create this network, create this inclusive environment, right? The forums is very important, to have the forums to discuss, to feel that you really be listened, you be heard, you have a voice, and then track, right? I mean, track the progress, be it transparency measures, indexes, reports, and track the progress and make sure that everybody has visibility on what's going on, because that makes a huge difference as well. And I would say, references. I mean, I always emphasize in references, you cannot be what you cannot see. So those are the things that makes the change in political, in corporations, anywhere, right? So I think those are the things that I would like to see spread out much larger than it is today.
I have another question, which is how to engage governments and corporates to build inclusive societies and organizations. I believe that you've already...
Yeah, I already answered that one. Maybe Francisco can add something.
Exactly. That's the reason I was asking it, or maybe if you want to add.
Thank you, Luisa. I think Sandra already took a lead on that one. In the case of governments to build inclusive societies from a gender perspective, because everything else then different topics require different answers from a gender perspective, I would say depending on the level of maturity of inclusion of the state, but always start with the law. Because I do think that the law changes, and if you bind corporations to have specific quotas and specific targets within gender equality through objective measures, you are going to start speeding change. It's not that this legislation is necessary. I don't even like this type of personally this type of legislation. They are the less evil, right? So they are, in Portuguese, I'm thinking about the word, but in English it's tough to say, but they are this kind of legislation that makes companies metric and establish minimums of diversity in the board, for example, are the less evil, right? So it's something that we need temporarily for a short period of time, and that we hope that in a couple of years or in a determined time frame, it stops to be enforced, right? So it's a temporary exclusive measure that we hope that it's not necessary, but I do think that it still is. So legislations. So that on the side, and that's how governments act towards corporations. So it's a double answer. I don't know if Sandra would like to add something else. I think legislation is always a great way for a short period of time, hoping that it would stop being necessary.
Yeah, pretty cover, Francisco. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have another question, which is maybe more of how can a law firm attract and keep female professionals? It's a very, very specific question. I don't know if you want to say something about it, and let's.
I leave Francisco because it's a law firm, so I guess that's the question
Exactly.
Francisco can address, but I would like to add something, being a female leader.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you're adding after, okay. I would say, well, I do come from a law firm where there's a lots of incredible female lead. So I'm very privileged to work within them majority of my time. But I would say it's very concrete. It's a very concrete answer, but to adapt the annual goals of billable hours. So for example, post-child period, you see, so that women can still stay in the force in a very objective and what it really matters at the end of the day criteria. After a childbirth, for example, if the woman desires to be a mother, which is not at all a base idea of what I just said, it's just in case that is so, I think that one good way of working towards this is just to adapt for a period of time the goals of billable hours. I think that's a great measure because it impacts directly and objectively the career after a childbirth, for example.
Right. That's good. That's very important. I definitely would add few things. I've been working a lot on this. I would say not for law firms, right? I was in financial service firms, but basically working a lot how to attract and develop and retain women, female talents. I would say one super key thing is the compensation. You have to look at having no gender gap, right? So that's substantially important. I mean, that cannot happen, and you have transparency in your compensation policies. Francisco mentioned about the maternity, paternity, I would say that those policies are important, what they call the maternity, paternity leaves, the child care as well, and as well, working from anywhere, flexible hours. So let's put this in a bucket, name it flexible and female focus policies. Then you have also on top of that a career path post-maternity, right? That's very important. The woman comes back and what is going to be her career path has to be very clear, very discussed, and very attractive to her. Another very important thing is the environment. The way to attract and really retain female talents is really to create an environment that they feel respected, that they feel that they are heard and they are seen, right? That's extremely important. Also, I would mention mentoring programs. I've been a mentor the last 12 years, and this is absolutely key for the female in your corporation. And as well, targets, right? You have to have targets. You have to have a measurement of the targets. You have to track the progress. You have to expose that information for that from people that are outside the company that wants to join the company and people that are within the company, right? And talent reviews, always looking, who are my talents independent of the gender, but obviously making sure that the women have definitely a career path. And finally, I mentioned before, and I always like to emphasize, if you have a woman CEO in the company, probability of the women will stay is much larger. If you have women in the senior management, as the same thing, and women in your board as well. So all the three elements, I've been a woman in those three elements, and I remember a lot of girls saying to me, I see you and I know this is possible. So I'm staying in this company because I know this company gives me the opportunity. So I think all the elements are very, very critical to attract and retain those female founders, female talents, sorry.
I think with this, it's a very positive note, it's a very inspiring concluding remarks. So I will thank you, Sandra. It was very inspiring. I thank you, Francisco, and we'll see each other in the next webinar, I guess, in the next year. And there's a short survey on the screen, so I would like to ask you before leaving, so all the participants, our public, before leaving to answer the questions. Thank you so much.
Luisa, thank you for the invitation. It was really a pleasure and an honor to be here. Francisco was great as well to join this webinar with you.
Great.
I think many people will feel inspired that it's possible to make it through the glass ceiling. So thank you.
I hope so. Thank you, Luisa. Have a good day, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.